We're about to dive into 6 years that literally tore the world apart and then put it back together in a completely new way, a way that still defines our world today. This is the story of the Second World War, from the first sparks of tension to the brand new global order it created.
And you know, that's not an exaggeration at all. Between 1939 and 1945, this conflict spread to every single continent except Antarctica. It shattered old empires, it created new superpowers, and it wiped out somewhere between 70 and 85 million lives. It truly was a world remade by fire.
So how on earth did the world get to this breaking point? Well, a catastrophe this big doesn't just happen overnight. The seeds were really sown years earlier, in the leftover bitterness from World War I and the sheer economic desperation of the Great Depression. That created the perfect storm for extreme, aggressive nationalism to take root.
What you see here is a steady, step-by-step march toward war. In 1936, Germany moved troops back into the Rhineland, a huge violation of the treaty that ended the First War. Then, they annexed Austria. You had the Munich Agreement, where other European powers basically gave away a chunk of Czechoslovakia, hoping to avoid another war. It was a policy called appeasement, but it was a false hope. The final proof? In 1939, Germany just took the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. It was clear that just giving in wasn't working. That failure to draw a line in the sand made war pretty much inevitable. And when it finally came, its speed and its sheer ferocity were unlike anything the world had ever seen before. Those first few years were all about the shocking success of the Axis powers.
The secret to this success, it was a terrifying new military idea called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The whole point was to avoid getting bogged down in trenches like in World War I. Instead, you'd use a massive, concentrated punch of tanks, planes, and infantry to just smash right through enemy lines, causing total chaos and winning before your opponent even knew what hit them.
On September 1, 1939, Poland became the very first country to feel the full, devastating power of this lightning war. The German invasion was the final straw. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and the Second World War in Europe was officially underway.
After a few quiet months, some people even called it the phony war, the German war machine roared back to life and turned west. In May of 1940, it just stormed through France, going around their super-fortified Maginot Line. And in just 6 weeks, France, one of the world's great powers, had fallen. It was an absolutely stunning victory that left the world just in shock. So with France out of the picture, Britain stood completely alone. Germany knew that before they could launch an invasion across the English Channel, they had to control the skies. That led to the Battle of Britain. The pilots of the Royal Air Force, even though they were outnumbered, managed to fight off the German Luftwaffe in this incredible, pivotal air campaign. Their victory forced Hitler to put off the invasion for good. But in revenge, Germany started the Blitz, a brutal and relentless bombing campaign against British cities. Now, while Europe was burning, we have to remember another brutal war had already been raging for years in Asia, between Japan and China. But 1941 was the year that these separate conflicts truly merged into one massive global catastrophe. 2 huge decisions on opposite sides of the planet were about to make this a true world war. First, in June, Hitler made a colossal gamble and launched a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union, which was supposed to be his ally. This opened up the Eastern Front, an unbelievably vast and brutal theater of war. Then, in December, Japan, trying to secure its growing empire in Asia, launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. And just like that, the world's 2 largest industrial powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, were pulled into the war on the side of the Allies.
And America's entry was an absolute industrial game-changer. Just look at that number. That's how many military and merchant ships the U.S. built during the war. President Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy, and he wasn't kidding. American factories started churning out planes, tanks, and ships at a rate the Axis powers just couldn't hope to match. It completely changed the balance of the war. Okay, so the Axis powers had pushed just about as far as they could go. But from late 1942 through 1943, a series of gigantic, world-changing battles would mark the moment the tide turned against them for good. This was the beginning of the end.
On the Eastern Front, that turning point came at a city named after the Soviet leader himself, Stalingrad. This battle became this raw symbol of sheer will, a horrific street-to-street, room-to-room fight where winning meant taking a single building. The German Sixth Army was basically lured into a meat grinder.
The human cost here is it's almost impossible to wrap your head around it. We're talking about nearly 2 million soldiers and civilians dead in and around this one city. When the battle finally ended with the surrender of the entire German army there, it was a catastrophic defeat. The Nazi war machine in the East would never really recover from it. At the same time, half a world away in the Pacific, the big naval turning point came at the Battle of Midway, and this was just 6 months after the shock of Pearl Harbor. Because of some brilliant code-breaking, the U.S. Navy knew exactly what Japan was planning and set a trap. The result for Japan was a disaster. They lost 4 of their best aircraft carriers, the absolute heart of their Navy. After Midway, America seized the momentum in the Pacific and never gave it back.
And you know, behind all these battlefield victories was the simple, overwhelming power of Allied industry. By 1943, especially with the United States in full production mode, the advantage was just insurmountable. Just look at that chart. Allied factories were basically burying the Axis powers under a literal avalanche of steel and firepower.
So, with the tide turned firmly in their favor, the Allies began the long, bloody final chapter of the war, closing the ring, pushing forward on every front to finally defeat the Axis powers.
It really kicks off on June 6, 1944, D-Day. The Allies launched the largest sea invasion in history, landing in Normandy and opening up the Western Front in France. From there, they pushed east, liberating Paris, while the Soviets were pushing relentlessly west. It all came to a head in May 1945, when Soviet forces took Berlin and Germany surrendered. But in the Pacific, the war raged on. The U.S. was engaged in a brutal island-hopping campaign, fighting horrific battles on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And this led to the final terrible act of the war, the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which forced Japan to finally surrender.
The war was over, but the world was left to count the cost. And these numbers, they're just staggering. They paint such a devastating picture of the human toll, especially the unbelievable losses in the Soviet Union and China. It was a global tragedy on a scale the world had never even imagined, and hopefully will never see again.
The world that rose from the rubble of 1945 was a fundamentally different place. The old European empires were shattered. The United States and the Soviet Union stood as the world's 2 new superpowers. And new organizations, like the United Nations, were created with the hope of making sure a catastrophe like this could never happen again. And all of this really leaves us with one final, very important question to think about. From the political alliances that define our world to the technologies we use every day, the legacy of that 6-year conflict is still all around us. The war might be over, but its long shadow continues to shape our present, and it challenges us to understand how and why.